Hello and welcome to this Chaffinch on fancy paper tutorial. I'm starting with a base layer of a light grey, the silver grey in the luminance. I'm using a combination of luminance, Pablos and polychromos for this, using the cold grey to add a little bit of detail to the beak now and go over the darker areas with the greyish black of the Pablo, making sure that middle line is pretty dark so it stands out. Smoothing over with the light cobalt blue in the luminance and then going in with the black into that middle line again, making sure I'm darkening up the darkest areas like at the top of the beak, around the eye, and just making sure that I'm leaving the detail of the catch light and filling in the rest of the eye so it's nice and beady and glassy as well. I'm just adding a little bit of detail and then going in with the light cobalt blue of the luminance just as a base layer and then into the cold greys to start to build up the feather texture using a light hand and following the direction of the feathers, going a little bit darker each time, using the black to finish and then darkening up around the beak to make sure that the shadows and the values are correct. Going in with a light pencil now. I've got the brown ochres in the luminance to again build up the feather texture of the face like I did with the head, and smoothing it out with a lighter colour of a warm grey. Coming down into the chest, and I'm following that same technique. I'm just building up through the ochres, through the nugget here, into the darker parts, making sure that it's not just uniformed and not all one colour, but adding definition by going over with the same colour a couple of times. Going in with the brown now, the walnut brown, and then just adding a little bit more with the slate grey, just darkening up. Now we've got darker parts, adding around the eye, it's easier to tell that we need to go darker in other areas and lighter in others. Just going over the whole thing to smooth the pencil strokes with the light grey, and the same with the face as well, a lighter colour where there's some highlights and slightly darker colours into the shadows. Just making sure that there's texture, but it's not too much. We're smoothing that out, going in with the dark sepia around the eye and the edge of the face, just to add a little bit of definition and a little bit of feather texture, but with a very light hand, following the direction of the feathers, darkening up certain areas again, moving into the beak with the black, making sure that's as dark as it needs to be all around the eye and the front of the face. Some little detail on the top of the head, and just smoothing out any texture in the beak as you want that to be nice and smooth. Moving on to the body and using exactly the same technique, building up through the ochres. We've got burnt ochre 50%, brown ochre 50% in the luminance pencils, and you can see I'm just building up from light to dark, making sure there's lots of texture, and then if the pencil strokes are too heavy, then I'm just going over the top with a beige or a light beige in the Pablos, adding a little bit of detail with the beige, getting that feather texture, and then the dark sepia is always great for going over the top to add a little bit more detail and a little bit more feather texture. Going over with the ochres again and the dark sepia, and then the cocoa, brilliant colour, just adding some detail through the chest and going back over with the ochres just to blend those two areas together. Back in with the dark sepia to darken up the areas around the wing, and under the wing there's very dark shadow, adding another base layer of the beige, going over the top with the cocoa to get that feather texture and making sure that I'm using the lines crisscrossing to create that feather texture in the body. Darkening up under the wing a little bit more with the dark sepia and adding shadows under the tummy as well. Going back over that feather texture, in with a little bit of ochre to blend it in, and the beige as well. Making sure that I'm smoothing any lines, and then going in with the slice tool to pick up a little bit of pencil, adding some lovely feather texture, and then we can go back over the top to add a little bit more shadow and some highlights with the white pencil. Making sure it's not uniform, there are some shadows, some depth. This is what's going to give that tummy area form, and then working into the wing, going in with the cream to begin with, the silver grey, and then just making sure that that top section is nice and blue, putting the white sections into the feathers. We've got the slate grey as well, adding that crisscross feather technique again, going in with some chestnuts and some siennas, the walnut brown to add texture, tiny little lines following the direction of the feathers, and going in with the greys just to add a little bit of detail to the edge of the wing, making sure that you're really looking at your reference photo and looking to see where all of the different little subtle colour changes are. If it's a little bit too pencily, then we can go over the top with a lighter colour to soften the pencil strokes. We want texture, but we don't want it to look grainy in any way. Going back over the top with the siennas and the chestnut colours, just to make sure that we're putting those colours, the transitions, into the next section of feathers, so it all looks cohesive and all part of the same drawing. Darkening up the edge of the feathers where needed with the greys, the cocoa and the black as well. Going with the slate grey for a little bit more texture over the top of the feather, using that crisscross technique again. Really great to get that feather texture. And the slate greys to darken up the edges, a little bit of a white band, making sure we're adding any highlights into the top of the feather as well. You can see lots of different colours going into the wing. Going in with the slice tool just to pick up a little bit of pencil to define the highlights and to add some texture, going in with the black with the edge of the wing, and then using the bluish pale at the bottom of the wing, which has a really lovely blue tone, adding some texture with the slate grey and the cocoa. Little lines on the wing where we can see them, making sure we're leaving that white section, and then darkening the shadows where the wings overlap as much as possible. We really need to get those values correct to make it look like it's standing out and that the wings are lying on top of the body. Adding some little line texture and just mapping in the rest of the feathers with the black or the dark sepia, drawing those lines just to make sure we don't lose them, a little bit like a jigsaw, and then we can fill in the gaps with a light colour to begin with, and then going in with your mid-tones, a little bit of the siennas as well, smoothing the paper with the lighter pencils, and then adding some depth with the mid-tone greys, the cold greys and the slate greys to add lots of depth to those tiny wing details. Darkening the shadows as much as you need to at the bottom, adding a little bit of white which smooths everything and also adds the highlights, getting rid of any greyness, adding the darker mid-tones to the areas of the wing, and then we continue under the belly as we've done before, adding a base layer, either a bluey colour or a cream, going in with the mapping of the feathers with the darker colours, and then we can fill in the gaps with those mid-tones, greys and pale colours, including the light beige and the beige, the silver grey, bluish pale, as well as the cream. And then we can go in with the darker colours, the black at the base, just making any adjustments now over the whole area, adding some detail with the slice tool. And once we've got the legs in, that's the finished chaffinch. You can see the detail of the feathers now if I zoom in, and all of the colours that blend into the next section to make it look nice and cohesive. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I look forward to seeing you next time.